A child interrupts a crowded trial, claiming she can heal the paralyzed judge if her father is set free. The courtroom laughs, but something in her words makes the judge tremble inside. The truth she carries is so powerful that it awakens not only justice, but also the judge's long-dormant body. Before we begin this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like on the video, which is very important to us, and tell us which city you're watching this story from. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a dry thunderclap, cutting through the nervous murmur of the crowd. It was a Monday in March in Chicago, and the Cook County Criminal Courthouse was overflowing with journalists, onlookers, and the families of those involved in what was already being called the trial of the year. Television cameras vied for the best angles, while reporters whispered their preliminary analyses into unblinking lenses. At the center of it all, imposing in his wheelchair behind the highest bench in the room, Judge Henry Morrison commanded the session with the authority of someone who had dedicated 23 years of his career to the bench. His gray hair was impeccably combed back, and his gold-rimmed glasses reflected the cold light of the spotlights that illuminated every corner of the solemn environment. Henry was known throughout the judicial district for his methodical coldness and for decisions that never left room for questioning. He was a man who had turned hardness into a virtue, especially after the accident that had left him paralyzed from the waist down 7 years ago. On the right side of the room, at the prosecution's table, Prosecutor Richard Sterling organized his papers with the confidence of someone who knew he held an irrefutable case. At 42, Richard had built a solid reputation based on certain convictions and a success rate that made other prosecutors in the city green with envy. His navy blue suit was immaculate, as was his red tie, strategically chosen to convey strength and determination. He knew the cameras would be on him throughout. The proceedings and his every gesture would be analyzed by legal commentators on the major television networks. At the defense table, the scene was quite different. Attorney Paul Matthews, a 55-year-old man with decades of experience, looked visibly apprehensive as he leafed through documents he knew wouldn't be enough to free his client. Beside him, with his head down and wearing a gray suit that looked borrowed, was Robert Evans, a 41-year-old systems engineer and family man who never imagined he would one day be sitting in the defendant's chair. Robert had his hands clasped on the table, and his eyes nervously scanned the crowd behind him, searching for the face that mattered most at that moment. When he finally found her, in the third row on the left, his heart calmed a little. Marina Evans, his 10-year-old daughter, was watching him with that determined gaze she had inherited from her mother. The girl was sitting next to her maternal grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor, a 68-year-old woman who held her granddaughter's hand tightly while trying to maintain her composure in the face of the whole situation. Marina was a special child, the kind who impressed adults with her intelligence and precocious maturity. Her brown hair fell in natural curls over her shoulders, and her green eyes shone with an intensity that drew attention wherever she went. That day she wore a light blue dress that her grandmother had chosen especially for the occasion, hoping that her granddaughter's angelic appearance might somehow positively influence her father's trial. Prosecutor Richard Sterling rose with all the pomp the occasion deserved. He knew this case would be the crowning achievement of his career and was already imagining the next day's newspaper headlines. The embezzlement scheme uncovered at the investment firm Panorama Capital had involved more than $15 million, and all the evidence pointed directly to Robert Evans, who had worked as a senior systems analyst at the company for 8 years. Your Honor, members of the jury, esteemed colleagues, and members of the press, Richard began in a firm, measured voice, we have before us a case that represents everything most reprehensible in human behavior when greed overcomes honesty and character. The defendant, Robert Evans, for months, used his technical knowledge and privileged access to Panorama Capital systems to systematically divert funds from investors, harming hundreds of families who entrusted their savings to that institution. The prosecutor's voice echoed through the room with the precision of a seasoned actor. He gestured in a calculated manner, at times pointing to Robert, at others addressing the jury directly. The evidence we will present is irrefutable, he continued. Logins made with the defendant's user account in the middle of the night, transfers authorized through his personal password, and a digital trail as clear as footprints in the sand. Mr. Robert Evans believed his expertise in technology would be enough to cover his crimes, but modern justice has equally sophisticated tools to unmask those who think they can. Cheat the system. Marina listened to every word with absolute attention, her small fists clenched in her lap. She knew the man in the dark suit was telling a version of the story that didn't match the truth she knew. Beside her, Mrs. Eleanor whispered quiet prayers, asking for St. Jude, the patron saint of impossible causes, to intercede for the family in their moment of desperation. Attorney Paul Matthews knew his defense would be an uphill battle. The technical evidence presented by the prosecution was indeed compelling, and he had only what he considered an emotional defense based on Robert's unblemished character throughout his career. When his turn came to speak, Paul rose with all the dignity he could muster. "Your Honor, Judge Henry Morrison," he said, respectfully addressing the judge, "what we have here is not a case of proven guilt, but of circumstances that can be explained in various ways. My client, Robert Evans, is a man of integrity, a dedicated father, an exemplary professional for 8 years at Panorama Capital, with no blemish on his professional or criminal record. Digital evidence, no matter how technical, cannot alone determine a man's guilt without considering other possibilities." Judge Henry watched everything with his usual impenetrable expression. Over the years, especially after the accident that had changed his life forever, he had developed an almost superhuman ability to remain emotionally detached from the cases he judged. For him, the law was clear, the evidence spoke for itself, and feelings had no place in his decisions. This stance had earned him both respect and fear in equal measure among colleagues and lawyers. Throughout the morning, Prosecutor Richard Sterling presented his argument with the precision of a surgeon. Documents were displayed, technical expert reports were explained in detail, and witnesses from the company gave testimony that seemed to definitively seal Robert's fate. With each piece of evidence presented, Marina felt her heart race, but she remained silent, watching every movement, every word, every gesture of the adults who would decide her family's future. When the clock in the room struck 12:15, Judge Henry announced a recess for lunch. The crowd began to disperse slowly, while journalists took the opportunity to make their first live analyses for the news broadcasts. Marina remained seated, still holding her grandmother's hand, watching her father being led by security guards to a private room. It was during this break that something began to stir inside the girl. She had a secret, a piece of information that no one seemed to have considered important, but which she knew could completely change the course of the story. Over the past few months, Marina had spent several nights in the hospital due to complications from an appendix surgery, and on one of those nights, specifically the night of January 15th to the 16th, her father had stayed by her side at Mercy General Hospital all through the early morning hours. The girl remembered that night perfectly because it had been one of the worst of her life. The pain was unbearable, and she had begged her father not to leave her alone. Robert had slept in an uncomfortable armchair next to her bed, holding her hand whenever she woke up scared. The night nurse, a kind woman named Esther, had commented several times on how touching it was to see such a dedicated father. What Marina didn't understand was why this information wasn't being considered in the trial. After all, if her father was with her at the hospital on the night of January 15th to the 16th, how could he have made the transfers the prosecutor claimed had happened on that exact date and time? When the session resumed at 2 in the afternoon, the room was even more crowded. The case's notoriety had spread across social media, and many people had left their jobs early to follow the unfolding of the trial that promised to be historic. Marina took her place beside her grandmother, but this time there was something different in her posture. She was no longer just observing, she was preparing. Prosecutor Richard Sterling resumed his closing argument with even more vigor. "Members of the jury," he said, walking slowly before the jury box, "we are facing a case that will test our ability to make justice prevail over emotional manipulation. It doesn't matter how likable the defendant may seem. It doesn't matter how many tears are shed in this room. What matters are the facts. And the facts are crystal clear. Robert Evans embezzled $15 million from Panorama Capital's investors using his technical skills and his privileged position in the company. As the prosecutor spoke, Marina felt a growing restlessness. She looked at her father, who kept his head down, clearly resigned to his fate. She looked at his lawyer, who was flipping through papers without much enthusiasm. She looked at the judge, impassive in his wheelchair, like a marble statue observing everything without showing any emotion. It was then that something inside her simply exploded. Marina stood up from her seat with a determination that surprised even herself. Her voice, clear and firm for a 10-year-old, cut through the solemn air of the room like a sharp blade. "Your Honor!" she shouted, causing every head to turn in her direction. "You're wrong! My dad didn't do any of it!" The entire room went into a state of absolute shock. Murmurs of surprise and indignation began to spread among those present, while court security looked to the judge for instructions on how to handle this unprecedented situation. Prosecutor Richard Sterling stopped mid-speech, dumbfounded, unsure how to react to the interruption. Judge Henry, for his part, stared at the girl with an expression that mixed irritation and surprise. "Young lady," he said in a controlled but firm voice, "you cannot interrupt a court session in this manner. Please sit down and remain silent, or I will have to ask for you to be removed from the courtroom." But Marina was not intimidated. On the contrary, she took a step forward, leaving the row where she was sitting and walking toward the center of the room. Her voice sounded even louder and clearer when she replied, "You said you want to hear the truth, didn't you? Well, I know the truth. My dad was with me at the hospital on the night you're talking about. He couldn't have been stealing money because he was taking care of me." The silence that followed was deafening. Not even the sound of cars outside or the hum of the air conditioning could break the tension that had taken over the room. Judge Henry leaned forward slightly, observing the girl with an attention he hadn't shown for anyone who appeared before him in years. Marina seized that moment of absolute attention to continue. "And there's more, Your Honor. If you let my dad go free, I'll make you walk again." The statement landed like a bomb on everyone present. Nervous laughter began to echo from some corners of the room, while others whispered comments about childish innocence and naivety. Prosecutor Richard Sterling shook his head in disdain, like someone watching a child throw an inconvenient tantrum. But Judge Henry did not laugh. Something in that child's eyes, in the absolute conviction of her voice, in the unbelievable courage she showed by challenging an entire judicial system, had touched him in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time in 7 years since the accident that had changed his life forever, he felt something different. It wasn't pain. It wasn't discomfort. It was something he had forgotten existed. An almost imperceptible tingling sensation in his legs. The tingling Judge Henry Morrison felt in his legs lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to shake the entire structure of emotional control he had built over 7 years. He blinked several times, trying to process what had just happened, as he watched the girl who remained standing in the center of the room, her arms crossed and a determination that defied any adult logic. The room remained in a state of commotion. Some spectators laughed openly at the child's naive claim about making the judge walk again, while others whispered comments about the lack of manners and respect in modern children. The journalists, meanwhile, had found the most dramatic moment of the trial, and their cameras focused alternately on Marina and the magistrate's perplexed expression. "Your Honor," said Prosecutor Richard Sterling, recovering from the initial shock and adopting a condescending tone, "I ask the court to completely disregard this childish interruption and maintain focus on the concrete evidence that has been presented. It is understandable that a child would want to defend her father, but we cannot allow emotions and childhood fantasies to contaminate a serious judicial process." But Judge Henry raised his hand, signaling for silence. Something in the way Marina had spoken, in the absolute conviction of her voice, intrigued him deeply. In his 23 years on the bench, he had witnessed every kind of attempt at emotional manipulation, from rehearsed tears to theatrical fainting spells, but he had never seen a child show such certainty about specific facts. "Young lady," he said, leaning slightly forward, "you claim your father was with you at the hospital on the night of January 15th to the 16th. Are you absolutely sure of that date?" Marina nodded vehemently. "Yes, I am, Your Honor. It was the night I had a lot of pain after my appendix surgery." My dad slept in the armchair next to my bed at Mercy General Hospital because I asked him not to leave me alone. The nurse, Esther, even said it was beautiful to see such a devoted father. Attorney Paul Matthews, who until then had been resigned to imminent defeat, felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. He had superficially investigated Robert's personal life, but hadn't delved into the family's medical details. Now, for the first time in the entire process, he saw a real possibility for a defense. "Your Honor," said Paul, rising quickly, "I request a recess so that we may verify the hospital records mentioned by the minor. If this information is correct, it would completely change the context of the accusations." Prosecutor Richard Sterling felt a chill run down his spine. Throughout the construction of the case, he had focused exclusively on the digital evidence, considering it irrefutable. The possibility that the defendant had a solid alibi for the night of the crimes had never been considered, and now he found himself in a situation that could compromise his entire argument. "Your Honor," Richard protested, "it is inadmissible that we alter the course of a trial based on the words of a 10-year-old child. The technical evidence presented is categorical and cannot be questioned by baseless allegations." But Judge Henry was experiencing something he hadn't felt in a long time: genuine curiosity. That child had awakened in him a need to investigate more deeply, to not be content with just the superficial evidence presented to him. It was as if an inner voice, long silenced, was beginning to whisper in his ears. "Mr. Sterling," Henry said in a firm voice, "in all my years on the bench I have learned that true justice requires us to investigate all possibilities, no matter how improbable they may seem. If there is a possibility that the defendant has an alibi for the night of the crimes, it is our duty to verify this information." Marina smiled for the first time since the trial had begun. She knew she had achieved something important, although she didn't fully understand the legal implications of what was happening. Her grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor, squeezed her hand tightly, murmuring a quiet prayer of gratitude. Robert, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, lifted his eyes for the first time in hours. The hope he saw in his daughter's face was simultaneously comforting and agonizing. He knew Marina was telling the truth about that night in the hospital, but he feared that even so, the digital evidence would be considered more convincing than a child's word. The judge ordered a 2-hour recess for the hospital records to be requested and analyzed. The room began to empty slowly, but many spectators chose to remain in the courthouse, feeling they were witnessing something historic. Journalists used the break to conduct live analyses, speculating on the possible developments of the case. Marina was led by her grandmother to a private room where they could talk. Mrs. Eleanor, a religious woman who had raised Robert alone after her husband died in a work accident, held her granddaughter's hands as she tried to fully comprehend what had happened. "My dear," Eleanor said in a soft voice, "are you absolutely sure your father was with you at the hospital that night? This is very important, and we can't make any mistakes." Marina nodded with conviction. "Grandma, I remember everything. Dad got to the hospital at 7 in the evening and only left the next morning when Dr. Paula came to examine me. He slept in the armchair, held my hand when I had nightmares, and even helped Nurse Esther change my IV when the vein in my arm got blocked." Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Henry was experiencing physical sensations he hadn't felt in 7 years. The tingling in his legs had returned, more intense this time, accompanied by a strange warmth that rose up his spine. He tried to move his toes inside his shoes, and to his absolute astonishment, felt an almost imperceptible response. Henry had grown accustomed to his paralysis. As a final sentence, the doctors had been clear about the extent of the damage to his spinal cord after the accident he had suffered 7 years earlier. It was a hopeless case for recovery, and he had learned to live with that reality, channeling all his energy into his work and developing an emotional coldness that protected him from any kind of vulnerability. The accident had happened on a rainy September night as Henry was returning home after a particularly difficult day in court. He had been investigating a complex corruption case involving influential businessmen and had received several veiled threats in the preceding weeks. At the time, A.E. truck had collided with his car on a poorly marked curve, causing injuries that left him paraplegic. The police had closed the case as an accident, and Henry, during the long months of recovery and adaptation, had chosen to believe that version. It was easier to accept that he had been a victim of bad luck than to face the possibility that someone had tried to silence him permanently. Over time, he had mentally filed away not only his suspicions about the accident, but also his passion for true justice. Now, watching that courageous girl who had defied an entire system to defend the truth, Henry felt as if something inside him was awakening. It was as if Marina had opened a door he had locked long ago, allowing light to enter his soul again. 2 hours later, when the session resumed, the atmosphere in the room was completely different. The court clerk had managed to get in direct contact with Mercy General Hospital and was in possession of Marina Evans's medical records for the period in January. Furthermore, nurse Esther Ferreira, who had worked the night shift from January 15th to the 16th, had been located and was on her way to the courthouse to testify. Judge Henry returned to his position with a visibly different demeanor. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there in the morning session, an intensity that made those present instinctively shift in their seats. Prosecutor Richard Sterling, on the other hand, appeared visibly nervous, repeatedly rearranging his papers and wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge announced, "the hospital records have been verified and confirmed that the defendant, Robert Evans, remained at Mercy General Hospital from 7:30 p.m. on January 15th until 8:15 a.m. on January 16th, accompanying his minor daughter during the post-operative period of an appendectomy, with complications." A murmur of surprise swept through the room. Marina smiled broadly, while Robert felt tears stream down his cheeks. Attorney Paul Matthews tried to maintain his professional composure, but the relief on his face was visible. The judge continued. "Furthermore, the nurse responsible for the night shift will be here in a few minutes to personally confirm the defendant's presence during the entire period when the fraudulent financial transactions allegedly occurred." Prosecutor Richard Sterling stood up abruptly, his face visibly altered. "Your Honor," he protested, with a trembling voice, "even if the defendant was physically present at the hospital, that does not eliminate the possibility that he used mobile devices or other technological tools to carry out the transactions remotely." But Judge Henry was experiencing a mental clarity he hadn't felt in years. "Mr. Sterling," he replied firmly, "the evidence presented by the prosecution specifically indicated that the transactions were carried out through the defendant's work terminal, which is physically located on the premises of Panorama Capital. If Mr. Evans was at the hospital during the entire period, it becomes impossible for him to have used that terminal." At that moment, the courtroom door opened, and a black woman of about 50, wearing a hospital uniform, entered. It was Esther Ferreira, the nurse who had cared for Marina during that crucial night. She walked with the dignity of someone who had dedicated over 20 years of her life to caring for others, and her eyes showed the natural kindness of someone who had chosen a profession based on compassion. When Esther saw Marina in the audience, her face lit up with a maternal smile. The girl waved shyly, remembering the kindness of the woman who had made a difficult night a little more bearable. The nurse was led to the witness stand, and Judge Henry greeted her with a courtesy that surprised everyone present. "Mrs. Ferreira," he said, "do you remember the night of January 15th to the 16th when you cared for the patient, Marina Evans?" "I do, Your Honor," Esther replied in a clear, confident voice. "It was a night that stood out, because we rarely see a father so dedicated. Mr. Evans didn't leave his daughter's side for a single minute. When the girl had nightmares or was in pain, he was always there to comfort her. He even offered to help me when I needed to change her IV because the vein was having issues." Prosecutor Richard Sterling felt the case slipping completely out of his control. For months, he had built his entire argument on the infallibility of digital evidence, and now he was faced with witnesses who completely contradicted his theory. But he wasn't willing to give up easily. "Mrs. Ferreira," Sterling said, rising with a tone that attempted to be intimidating. "Are you absolutely certain that the defendant did not leave the room even for a few minutes? During the night? Is it not possible that he briefly stepped out while the child was sleeping?" Esther looked at the prosecutor with the patience of someone who had dealt with many difficult people throughout her career. "Sir," she replied firmly, "I have worked in hospitals for 22 years, and my job is to observe everything that happens with my patients. I can assure you that father did not leave his daughter's side even for a cup of coffee. In fact, I brought him coffee myself during the night because he refused to leave the room." At that moment, Judge Henry again felt the tingling in his legs, more intense than before. This time the sensation was accompanied by a kind of warmth that spread throughout his body, as if every cell were waking from a long sleep. He discreetly tried to move his toes and felt a clearer response, an almost imperceptible movement that filled him with a hope he had forgotten existed. The nurse continued her testimony, describing in detail how Robert had stayed awake for most of the night, speaking quietly to Marina whenever she woke up, helping with medical procedures and showing a dedication that had touched the entire hospital staff. Judge Henry watched attentively, taking in every word, every gesture, every expression from Esther. There was an authenticity in her that contrasted sharply with the prosecutor's calculated performance. It was the difference between someone who had lived a real experience and someone who was trying to construct a narrative based only on cold data. When the testimony concluded, the silence that filled the room was heavy with meaning. Everyone present understood that they had just witnessed a turning point that would completely change the course of the trial. Marina held her grandmother's hand tightly, feeling that she had managed to make the truth prevail, even if she didn't fully understand all the legal implications of what was happening. Judge Henry then announced another recess, this time so he could carefully analyze all the evidence in light of the new information. But as he was preparing to leave the room, something extraordinary happened. He tried to move his wheelchair and instinctively pushed with his legs. To his absolute astonishment, he felt the muscles respond slightly, as if they were remembering a long-forgotten function. The judge concealed his surprise, but inside he was experiencing a whirlwind of emotions he hadn't felt in years. It was as if the courage of that little girl, her unwavering faith in the truth, was somehow infecting his entire being and awakening strengths he believed were lost forever. When Judge Henry Morrison arrived in his chambers after the second recess of the day, he could no longer ignore the physical sensations occurring in his body. The tingling had intensified and now extended throughout his lower back, creating a feeling of life he had completely forgotten. For the first time in 7 years, he consciously tried to contract his thigh muscles and felt a weak but undeniable response. Sitting in his wheelchair before the mahogany desk that dominated the room, Henry opened the case file with renewed attention. Throughout his career, he had developed the habit of accepting the evidence presented by the parties, trusting in the competence and honesty of the prosecutors and lawyers who appeared in his court. But now, driven by a curiosity he hadn't felt in years, he began to examine each document with the eye of an investigator. What he discovered left him deeply disturbed. The digital evidence, though technically correct, had temporal gaps that had not been adequately explained. The access log showed activity on Robert's terminal during the night of January 15th to the 16th, but there were no records of anyone entering or leaving the Panorama Capitol building. How could someone use a terminal without first physically accessing the building? Henry picked up the phone and called the company's security department directly. After a few minutes on hold, he managed to speak with the head of security, a former police officer named Sebastian, who had worked in the building for over 10 years. "Mr. Sebastian," Henry said, "this is Judge Henry Morrison, the judge presiding over the Panorama Capitol case. I need to confirm some information about employee access records. Could you please check if there is any record of employee Robert Evans entering the building on the night of January 15th to the 16th? "Of course, Your Honor," Sebastian replied promptly. "Just a moment while I check the system." After a few minutes of silence, the man's voice returned with a tone of confusion. "Judge, this is very strange. There is no entry record for Mr. Robert Evans on that date. In fact, his last access was on the afternoon of the 15th, when he left at 5:20 p.m. The revelation hit Henry like a punch to the gut. If Robert had left work at 5:20 p.m. and was at the hospital by 7:30 p.m., it was physically impossible for him to have returned to the building during the night to carry out the fraudulent transactions. Someone had used his credentials remotely, or worse, someone had manipulated the records to frame him. Henry felt a wave of indignation course through his body, accompanied by a physical sensation that surprised him. His abdominal muscles contracted involuntarily, as if his body were responding to the intensity of his emotions. It was as if the discovery of injustice was literally bringing life back to the parts of his body that had been dormant for years. The judge decided to dig even deeper. He requested the clerk to bring all the depositions of the witnesses listed by Prosecutor Richard Sterling, including those that had been dismissed during the preliminary phase. It was then that he discovered something that made him question not only this case, but the entire trust he had placed in the system throughout his career. Among the dismissed depositions was that of Nurse Esther Ferreira. She had been interviewed during the preliminary investigation and had clearly mentioned Robert's presence at the hospital throughout the night. However, her deposition had been filed away with the justification that it was not relevant to the case. The decision had been made by Prosecutor Richard Sterling himself, who argued that medical issues of the defendant's family were unrelated to the financial crimes being investigated. Henry felt anger rise within him like a volcano about to erupt. For years he had prided himself on presiding over a court where justice prevailed over any personal interest. To discover that a prosecutor had deliberately withheld evidence that could exonerate a defendant was an affront to everything he believed in. But there was more. Examining the case files with renewed attention, Henry discovered that other testimonies had been manipulated or simply ignored. A cleaning staff member at Panorama Capital had reported seeing suspicious movement on the administrative floor during the night, but his testimony had been dismissed as unreliable due to his low level of education. An IT technician had mentioned irregularities in the system logs, but his observations were filed away as unfounded technical speculation. Each discovery was like a puzzle piece, revealing an increasingly disturbing picture. Henry began to realize that he was not dealing with an isolated case of procedural negligence, but rather a systematic manipulation designed to ensure Robert's conviction, regardless of his actual guilt. Meanwhile, in the courthouse waiting area, Marina was talking to her grandmother about the day's events. The girl, despite her young age, had a keen perception of what was happening around her. She had noticed how nervous the prosecutor had become after her testimony, how his hands trembled as he rearranged his papers, how his voice had lost its initial confidence. "Grandma," Marina said, tugging on the sleeve of Mrs. Eleanor's dress, "that man in the dark suit isn't telling the truth about Dad, is he?" Eleanor looked at her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Her little girl had shown extraordinary courage, but she feared the consequences of challenging powerful people. "My dear," she replied carefully, "sometimes adults make mistakes, even when they think they are doing the right thing. The important thing is that the truth always comes out in the end." But Marina was not satisfied with vague answers. She had grown up hearing the whispered conversations among the adults in her family, catching fragments of information that the elders thought she didn't understand. She knew her father was being accused of stealing money. She knew some very important people wanted to see him in prison, and she knew something was not right with this whole process. Back in his chambers, Henry decided to do something he hadn't done in years: personally investigate the background of Prosecutor Richard Sterling. What he found left him even more disturbed. Richard had built his career on an impressive string of convictions in high-profile cases, always involving defendants who in some way challenged the interests of influential businessmen or powerful politicians. 5 years earlier, Richard had secured the conviction of an investigative journalist who was about to publish a report on corruption in public contracts. 3 years earlier, he had managed to imprison an accountant who had discovered tax irregularities in a construction company with political connections. And now, Robert Evans, a systems analyst who perhaps knew too much about suspicious financial movements at Panorama Capital. The pattern was too clear to be a coincidence. Henry felt as if he were waking from a deep sleep and discovering that the world around him had transformed into an elaborate farce. Every case Richard had won potentially represented an innocent person who had been sacrificed to protect dark interests. It was then that Henry remembered his own past, a time when he too investigated corruption cases with the passion of someone who believed he could make a difference. 7 years earlier, shortly before his accident, he was conducting an investigation into a complex scheme involving embezzlement in public contracts, money laundering through shell companies, and the participation of prominent figures from the political and business worlds. At the time, Henry had received several veiled threats. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, cars following him when he left the courthouse, messages left on his answering machine suggesting he should focus on less complicated cases. He had reported the intimidation to the police, but the investigations always hit bureaucratic obstacles or a lack of concrete evidence. And then came the accident, a collision on a poorly marked curve on a rainy September night. The technical report indicated a mechanical failure in the truck that hit him, and the driver, a simple man from the countryside, swore his brakes had suddenly failed. The case was closed as a fatality, and Henry, during the long months of recovery and adaptation to life in a wheelchair, had chosen to believe this version. Now, observing the systematic way Richard manipulated cases to protect powerful interests, Henry began to question whether his accident had really been a coincidence. The physical sensations he was experiencing seemed to be directly connected to this discovery, as if his body were reacting to the revelation of the truth he had suppressed for years. Henry tried again to move his legs and felt a stronger response this time. It wasn't yet enough to stand or take steps, but it was undeniable progress. It was as if each revelation about the injustice was literally bringing life back to parts of his body that had remained inert. The judge then decided to make a call he hadn't made in years. He searched his personal files for the phone number of federal agent David Miles, a man of integrity who had worked with him on the investigation that was cut short by the accident. David was one of the few people in the justice system Henry still trusted completely. David answered on the third ring, his voice showing genuine surprise at hearing Henry's name. "Judge Morrison, what a surprise to get a call from you after all these years. How have you been?" "David," Henry replied, "I need to talk to you about something very serious. Do you remember the investigation we were conducting before my accident, about the public contract embezzlement scheme?" "Of course I remember," David said, his tone immediately becoming more serious. "It was one of the biggest frustrations of my career to have to close that case. Why are you asking about it now?" Henry quickly explained the situation with Robert Evans's trial, the evidence manipulated by prosecutor Richard Sterling, and the connections he was beginning to see between different cases. David listened in silence, and when Henry finished speaking, there was a long pause before the response. "Judge Morrison," David said finally, "I never completely stopped investigating that scheme. Not officially, but in my spare time, I've been tracking suspicious movements and gathering information. If your suspicions are correct, we might finally have an opportunity to unmask this entire organization." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, during which David revealed that he had identified a pattern of manipulated cases, always involving the same prosecutors, lawyers, and businessmen. Richard Sterling's name appeared frequently in this network, always as the prosecutor responsible for securing convictions that protected specific interests. When the conversation ended, Henry felt like a different man. The discovery that he was not alone in his search for the truth, that there were other people of integrity willing to fight against systemic corruption, had reignited a flame he thought had been extinguished forever. It was at that moment that his cell phone rang. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Be careful what you're investigating. Some accidents can happen again. Your family might pay the price too." Henry felt a chill run down his spine, but at the same time he experienced something surprising. His leg muscles contracted involuntarily, as if preparing for a fight. It was as if the threat, instead of intimidating him, was further awakening his determination and, consequently, his physical recovery. He saved the message as evidence and immediately called David, who promised to launch an investigation into the origin of the threat. After that, Henry made a decision he hadn't made in years. He was going to fight. Not just for Robert Evans's case, but against the entire corrupt system that had destroyed the lives of so many innocent people. When he returned to the courtroom for the afternoon session, Henry was unrecognizably transformed. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there in the morning, a steely determination that made everyone in the room instinctively sit up straighter. Marina, watching him from the audience, smiled as if she could feel the change that had occurred in the judge. Prosecutor Richard Sterling, on the other hand, appeared visibly shaken. His hands trembled slightly as he organized his papers, and there was sweat on his forehead despite the courtroom's air conditioning. It was as if he could sense that something fundamental had shifted in the course of events. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Henry announced in a firm voice, "after a careful review of all the evidence and testimonies, I have determined that this proceeding has serious irregularities that require immediate investigation. I am ordering a temporary suspension of this trial until all facts are properly clarified." Prosecutor Richard Sterling shot to his feet, his face contorted with anxiety. "Your Honor, this decision is completely unnecessary. The evidence against the defendant is irrefutable and cannot be questioned by mere coincidences." "Mr. Sterling," Henry replied with a coldness that cut like ice, "when crucial evidence is withheld, when testimonies are manipulated, and when the truth is deliberately concealed, we are not talking about coincidences. We are talking about obstruction of justice." The silence that followed was deafening. At that moment, everyone in the room understood they were no longer watching an ordinary trial, but the beginning of a revelation that could shake the entire structure of the local judiciary. 3 weeks had passed since the trial's suspension, and the Cook County Criminal Courthouse had become the epicenter of an investigation that was shaking the foundations of power in Chicago. Federal Agent David Miles had mobilized a special task force that worked around the clock to unravel the extent of the criminal enterprise that Judge Henry Morrison had begun to uncover. During this period, Henry had experienced a transformation that defied any medical explanation. The sensations in his legs had progressively intensified, and now he could easily move his toes, contract his thigh muscles, and even feel pain when someone touched his legs. His doctors were perplexed, speaking of miracles and inexplicable recovery, but Henry knew his healing was directly linked to his return to the pursuit of true justice. On the morning of the session that would determine the fate of Robert Evans and possibly many others involved in the scheme, Marina woke up with a strange feeling. It was as if she could feel in the air that something very important was about to happen. She put on her best dress, a yellow one her mother had bought before she passed away, and asked her grandmother Eleanor to braid her hair beautifully. "My dear," Eleanor said as she combed her granddaughter's hair, "you know today could be a very special day, don't you? Your father might finally come home, and it will all be thanks to your courage." Marina nodded seriously. "Grandma, I always knew Dad was innocent, and I also always knew that Judge would walk again. Some things you just feel in your heart, and the heart never lies." When they arrived at the courthouse, the crowd was even larger than on the first day of the trial. Journalists from all over the country had traveled to Chicago to cover what was already being called the case that will change American justice. Marina held her grandmother's hand tightly as they walked through the cameras and microphones vying for any statement. In his chambers, Henry was making the final preparations for the most important session of his career. For the first time in 7 years, he had managed to stand for a few seconds the night before, supporting himself on the desk in his home office. The feeling of the floor beneath his feet again had been indescribable, like rediscovering a part of himself he thought he had lost forever. David Miles arrived at the chambers carrying a bulky folder containing the results of 3 weeks of intensive investigation. "Henry," he said with evident satisfaction, "we have enough evidence to dismantle the entire organization. What we've uncovered goes beyond your worst suspicions." The investigation had revealed that the criminal scheme had been operating for over 10 years, involving a complex network of businessmen, politicians, corrupt judges, prosecutors, and police officials who manipulated the judicial system to protect specific financial interests. Panorama Capital was just one of many front companies used to launder money embezzled from public contracts, and Robert Evans had been chosen as a scapegoat because he had started asking questions about irregularities he had noticed in the system. The leader of the organization was Marcus Thorne, a billionaire businessman who owned a conglomerate of construction companies with multi-million-dollar contracts with various city and state agencies. Thorne had built an empire based on bribes, inflated contracts, and the systematic elimination of anyone who might threaten his scheme. Operating alongside Thorne was Congressman Charles Manning, responsible for passing laws that facilitated the group's business and legally shielded their operations. The third member of the leadership was Deputy Chief Peter Franklin, who manipulated investigations, forged evidence, and ensured that cases landed in the hands of allied prosecutors. Prosecutor Richard Sterling was just a cog in the machine, but a crucial one. His role was to ensure that the organization's enemies were convicted, regardless of their actual guilt, and that the group's members escaped any charges. In return, he received a luxury apartment in Miami, a monthly salary of $50,000, and the promise of a future appointment to the Court of Appeals. David had managed to record a phone conversation between Richard and Peter Franklin, where the two openly discussed how to frame Robert Evans. In the recording, it was clear that they knew of the engineer's innocence, but needed a culprit to close the Panorama Capital case and protect the real perpetrators. But the most shocking discovery of the investigation concerned Henry's own accident 7 years earlier. The driver of the truck that had hit him was an employee of a transport company owned by Marcus Thorne. David had located the man, who was now living in hiding in rural Indiana, and had obtained a full confession from him. The accident had been planned in meticulous detail. The truck's brakes had been sabotaged to fail exactly at the curve where Henry passed, every night on his way home from work. The driver, a simple man with young children, had been coerced into participating in the plan under threat of death to his family. After the accident, he had been paid to keep silent and was instructed to move far away from Chicago. When Henry learned the truth about his accident, he felt a wave of emotions so intense that his entire body reacted. For the first time since his paralysis, he managed to move both legs simultaneously, flexing his knees and feeling blood circulate normally. Through limbs that had been inert for years, it was as if the revelation of the injustice he had suffered was literally bringing his body back to life. The session was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, and when the time came, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Federal authorities, journalists, onlookers, and families of those involved vied for every inch of available space. Marina was sitting in the front row next to her grandmother and her father, who had been released from pre-trial detention after the initial revelations of the investigation. Robert held his daughter's hand with tears in his eyes. During those 3 weeks, he had fully understood what Marina had done for him. A 10-year-old child had had the courage to confront an entire corrupt system, and her unwavering faith in the truth had been the catalyst for the largest anti-corruption operation in Chicago's recent history. When Judge Henry entered the room, the silence was absolute. Everyone could see there was something different about him, an energy that emanated from his presence and transformed the atmosphere of the room. He maneuvered his wheelchair to its usual position, but there was a posture in his body that suggested the chair would not be permanent. At the prosecution table, 3 empty chairs marked the absence of Prosecutor Richard Sterling and his assistants, who had been arrested the previous night as part of the federal operation. In their place sat Federal Prosecutor Dr. Carmen Silva, a 50-year-old woman known for her absolute integrity and her expertise in corruption cases. Dr. Silva rose with the dignity of someone who held in her hands not only the truth about Robert Evans's case, but about an entire criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. "Your Honor," she said in a clear, firm voice, "we are here not just to correct a specific injustice, but to expose a criminal enterprise that has corrupted the very foundations of our judicial system." For 2 hours, Carmen presented the evidence collected by the federal task force. Phone recordings, bank documents, confessions from informants, and a trail of corruption that stretched across dozens of manipulated cases over the years. Each revelation was met with murmurs of outrage from the audience, who watched the unmasking of an organization that had destroyed the lives of hundreds of innocent people. When it was time to present the specific evidence about Robert Evans's case, Carmen called to the witness stand the very driver who had caused Henry's accident. Joseph Joe Miller was a 55-year-old man who carried the weight of 7 years of guilt and forced silence. With a choked voice and tears streaming down his face, Joe confessed how he had been coerced into participating in the attack on the judge. "Your Honor," he said, looking directly at Henry, "for all these years, I prayed for you to recover. I knew you were a good man, and that's why they wanted to get rid of you. You were getting too close to the truth about them." Henry felt an emotion so intense upon hearing that confession that his leg muscles contracted involuntarily. It was as if every word from Joe was undoing 7 years of physical and emotional paralysis. "Mr. Miller," Henry said with a compassionate voice, "you were a victim of them too. Your courage to speak the truth now is what matters." It was then that Carmen presented the most devastating piece of evidence, the recording of the conversation between Richard Sterling and Peter Franklin, where they openly discussed how to frame Robert. The voices of the two men echoed through the room via the speakers, revealing a cynicism and cruelty that left everyone present stunned. In the recording, Richard clearly said, "It doesn't matter if he's innocent or guilty. We need someone to take the fall for the Panorama embezzlement. Thorne is getting nervous and wants this case closed quickly. Can you plant more evidence on his computer?" And Peter replied, "I've already planted everything needed. The logs show activity in the early morning, and I made sure no one checked the building's entry records. If some lawyer gets too smart, you make sure the judge doesn't accept the evidence." The silence that followed the playback of the recording was filled with indignation and horror. Marina held her father's hand tightly, feeling that finally the truth she had always known was being acknowledged by everyone. But the most dramatic moment of the session was yet to come. When all the evidence had been presented and it was clear that Robert Evans was completely innocent, Judge Henry made a decision no one expected. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in an emotional voice, "for 7 years I have remained seated in this chair, not just due to physical paralysis, but because I had lost faith in the possibility that true justice could prevail in our system. A 10-year-old girl gave me that faith back." Henry paused, took a deep breath, and then something happened that no one in the room would ever forget. Placing his hands on the arms of his wheelchair, the judge pushed and slowly rose to his feet. His muscles responded with a strength they hadn't shown in 7 years, and when he managed to stand completely upright, a gasp of astonishment swept through the room. Marina leaped from her seat with a cry of joy. "I told you I'd make you. Walk again," she exclaimed, clapping her hands as tears of happiness streamed down her cheeks. Standing, supported only by the strength of his own legs, Henry solemnly declared, "Robert Evans, you are completely exonerated of all charges. I apologize on behalf of the state for the injustice that was almost committed against you and your family." But Henry wasn't finished. Taking his first shaky steps in 7 years, he moved toward the center of the room, each movement followed by the respectful silence of everyone present. "I hereby order the immediate arrest of Marcus Thorne, Charles Manning, and Peter Franklin for the crimes of racketeering, corruption, money laundering, and attempted murder," he declared in a firm voice. "I also order the reopening of all cases in which prosecutor Richard Sterling was involved, so that other injustices may be corrected." The room erupted in applause as Marina ran toward the judge. Henry bent down with difficulty but with determination and hugged the girl who had changed his life and the lives of so many others. "Thank you for teaching me that courage and faith can move mountains," he whispered in her ear. Robert approached with tears streaming down his face and embraced his daughter and the man who had had the courage to seek the truth even when it seemed impossible. Mrs. Eleanor, watching the scene from the audience, made the sign of the cross repeatedly, thanking St. Jude for the divine intervention. In the days that followed, Operation True Justice, as it came to be known, resulted in the arrest of dozens of people involved in the scheme. Marcus Thorne was arrested at his Highland Park mansion while trying to flee to Miami. Congressman Charles Manning was impeached and arrested on the floor of the State Assembly. Peter Franklin was found at a farm in the countryside trying to destroy evidence. More than 100 cases were reopened, and dozens of innocent people who had been unjustly convicted had their sentences overturned. The operation became a landmark in the fight against corruption in the United States, studied in law schools, and serving as a model for other investigations. Henry resumed his duties as a judge with a renewed passion for justice. His physical recovery was complete, and he became a symbol of how the pursuit of truth can literally restore a person's life. He founded an institute dedicated to investigating cases of judicial injustice and began giving lectures on the importance of integrity in the judicial system. Marina was honored by the American Bar Association as the youngest person to receive the title of honorary citizen for her contribution to justice. She declared in her acceptance speech that she wanted to be a judge when she grew up, to help other people like her father who were unjustly accused. Robert resumed his life, but now with a completely different perspective on the importance of fighting against injustice. He became a human rights activist and dedicates part of his time to helping other families facing situations similar to what his family experienced. 6 months after the trial, a plaque was installed at the entrance of the Cook County Criminal Courthouse with the following words: "Here, a child proved that courage is stronger than power, and that truth, when upheld with faith, can restore movement even to those destined for immobility." Every time Marina passes the plaque with her father and grandmother, she smiles and whispers a small prayer of gratitude. She learned that even though she is small, she can make a difference in the world when she has the courage to stand up for what is right. And every time she sees Judge Henry walking normally through the courthouse corridors, she knows that miracles really do happen when justice and faith work together. The story of Marina Evans became a legend in the city of Chicago, told from generation to generation as an example that a small person with a big heart can move mountains and change the world around them. And whenever someone is about to give up fighting for justice, they remember the girl who made a judge walk again simply because she believed that truth always wins in the end. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Marina, Robert, and Judge Henry has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by the courage of this extraordinary girl who challenged an entire system to save her father, please leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the purest and most courageous side of the human soul, showing that truth and justice always prevail when we have faith and determination. You are part of this family that believes in the transformative power of good stories. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, where once again, hope will conquer despair.